Hello, I'm Andrew Davis of Durham University. Contemporary education features many ways of categorising learners. These concentrate on those deemed to be suffering from problems or disorders. Examples include dyslexia, ADHD, dyspraxia, conduct disorder, and many others. This session offers some philosophical reflections on the status of these categories. It focuses particularly on the work of the Canadian philosopher Ian Hacking. I'm drawing on several of my publications: The Credentials of Brain-Based Learning, 2004, Ian Hacking, Learner Categories and Human Taxonomies, 2008, and a book, Developing the Dyslexia Debate, 2016. By the way, I'm described as the editor of that volume. The description is a bit misleading because I wrote a substantial endnote in that volume. Today's session draws heavily on that endnote. There was much debate about whether anything real exists about how we currently classify learners and their problems. I will look especially at two examples, dyslexia and ADHD. And I examine one particular way of thinking about their existence, namely biological or neurophysiological concomitants. One of my colleagues and one of the authors of the book about dyslexia is Julian Elliott. We talked together for some years. Some years back, he was involved in more than one TV broadcast about dyslexia. Let's introduce him via a little video extract.
The test enables many who are diagnosed as dyslexic to get special help, which costs many millions. But new evidence suggests this is a waste of public money.
Diagnosing children so as to hive off one special group of poor readers from another is wasted effort. It's misguided.
Well, every time I see one of my students with a laptop computer because they're dyslexic, it makes me think, with that money we could give one-to-one support to a child very early on in their education who's desperately in need of it. And if we did that, we would circumvent all the problems that we have to pick up later. Seems to me to be an outrage.
Research, though, now suggests that the common view of dyslexia is a myth. Until now, only academics have been aware of the new findings, but now they're reaching teachers. Here, Durham University is holding a conference to tell them that almost everything they believe about dyslexia is wrong.
People, if you talk to the lay public and you ask them about dyslexia, they'll say it's something to do with vision.
In Durham, teachers who face the anguish of such parents every day hear Professor Elliott begin with the most commonly held view of all.
The letters are hopping around all over the page. Or
the suggestion that dyslexics see words differently, which explains why they make mistakes like reversing letters, has led many parents to buy special glasses and other aids to help children overcome the problem.
Lots of these kinds of ideas about reversibility.
Yet most researchers now believe that dyslexics can see just as well, or just as badly, as the rest of us.
In other words,
having heard that dyslexia is not caused by poor coordination nor poor vision, teachers in Durham are about to hear something just as surprising. Academics say there is no way of even distinguishing dyslexics from any other poor readers.
I've been in clinical practice 20 years, and if someone came in with a child now and said to me, "Can you tell me whether this kid is dyslexic or not?" I wouldn't have the faintest idea how to do it. We can't afford to ignore the evidence that's in front of us. If we're going to have a scientific approach, then we can't allow ourselves to come up with pseudo terms which are meaningless.
What it boils down to is that when it comes to reading, either all children with a serious problem are dyslexic, or none of them is. Some of the teachers at the Durham conference are unhappy with what they've heard.
Would you say that dyslexia doesn't exist?
What I say is I can't define it, and I couldn't tell you if I saw a dyslexic person what they would be.
Maybe you should spend a day with a dyslexic person and find out the
I spent
problems that they
30
have.
years with kids with reading difficulties. Dyslexia, I see them, my kids come to me all the time, I do assessments with them all the time, but there is no clear way in my head, and the more I've read and the more I've looked at the studies, there's no clear way that I can differentiate between them.
Isn't this going to cause massive anxiety for parents who are going to watch this programme? Because that would be my concern. We work with parents who have fought for years to get their child support, to get them a diagnosis, to get them a statement. What's this kind of message going to give out to people? It's going to say there's no such thing as dyslexia. There's no such thing. You're going to have a whole load of anxious parents now ringing up the school, frantically saying, he has got dyslexia, hasn't he? You're not going to take away his support.
What are you saying? We keep quiet about what we know about this topic now. We hush it up, we just write it in scientific journals, and we don't say anything about that to the public anymore.
The TV programmes in which Joe was involved had titles like The Dyslexia Myth, The Death of Dyslexia, and so on. So he shouldn't have been surprised to get quite a lot of hate mail after these programmes were broadcast. A characteristic quotation from Joe, quote, "Experts have failed to agree what dyslexia is, and being diagnosed as dyslexic makes virtually no difference to the treatment that the individual requires." As I say, he was claiming to be surprised about the hate mail he got after claims like that. Now let's sample some of the things Joe's opponents had to say. Here's something from the British Dyslexia Association. They say, dyslexia is primarily an information processing difficulty, neurological in origin and affecting language. They go on, dyslexia survives as a term because it is a real condition. In excess of 1 million people download information every month. Is he, that's Joe, suggesting that they are all suffering from some kind of emotional delusion? And Dyslexia Action, that's a charity, said, quote, "Julian Elliott is plain wrong. We know dyslexia has a genetic basis." And after this kind of comment, they also were involved, I think, in hate mail and complaints to Ofcom about the programme called The Dyslexia Myth. This is a high-stakes issue, and there's a lot of misery associated with this kind of condition. But I'm frequently puzzled by the assertions and apparent assumptions on either side of the debates. The protagonists obviously think they know what they're supporting and denying. The more I look at it, the more obstacles I discover to becoming clear about verdicts either way. Maybe, just maybe, there are some false dichotomies lurking here. By the end of this session, I hope you will have increased your levels of informed uncertainty. I want to begin by drawing some parallels between debates about the status of mental health labels and the status of learning disability labels. So with psychiatric disorders, we have a medical model versus the anti-psychiatry movement. Typical figures included Thomas Satz and R.D. Laing. We're going back to the 60s, 70s here. Anti-psychiatry held that it was wrong to think of mental health problems such as schizophrenia as illnesses located in individuals. They were rather a matter of dysfunctional relationships between individuals and others, especially their families. Think of an analogical way of thinking about learning disabilities. Again, we can have a medical model versus a mythology social construction model. Here are crude sketches of extreme positions that might be held by protagonists in these debates. At least some psychiatric disorders really exist. No psychiatric disorders really exist. They are merely constructions involving classifications of people that fail to reflect objective reality. Now let's turn to learner categories. At least some learner categories reflect real differences between learners. By way of contrast, no learner categories reflect real differences between learners. They are merely constructions involving classifications of people that fail to reflect objective reality. Let's note in passing a couple of sources commenting on the incidence of so-called learning disabilities. These sources feel they know what it is to say that these conditions exist. They can even offer a verdict on the proportion of the population who suffer from such conditions. An NHS website that I recently accessed says, dyslexia is a common learning difficulty that can cause problems with reading, writing, and spelling. It's a specific learning difficulty, which means it causes problems with certain abilities used for learning, such as reading and writing. Unlike a learning disability, intelligence isn't affected. It's estimated up to 1 in 10 people in the UK has some degree of dyslexia. Now let's turn to ADHD. Grimm, Krantz and Reif 2020 say, quote, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, is a developmental disorder with symptoms of inattentiveness, impulsiveness and hyperactivity, which leads to impairments in everyday life and manifests before the age of 12. The developmental trajectory shows a typical course of clinical symptoms, e.g. decrease of hyperactivity, occurrence of comorbid disorders, e.g. addiction and depression, as well as economic costs and social impairments. ADHD has a worldwide prevalence of 5 to 7% of school-aged children. So, first impressions of these sources are that they're going for a biological cum medical construal of what it means for these conditions to exist. So let's turn to the Canadian philosopher Ian Hacking. He's very insightful on the way we classify people and the status of these classifications. First of all, what he calls indifferent kinds. Think of the periodic table of the elements. Chemical elements cannot be aware of being classified. Nothing about how they're classified can make a difference to their inherent properties. They are what they are and would be what they are even had no human beings ever existed to classify them. That's why they're called indifferent kinds. Then we have Hacking's human kinds. Humankind is his term for the kinds of people, working class, child abusers, pregnant teenagers, the unemployed, typically studied by the human sciences. Then we come to what he calls biologized kinds. Hacking talks about these in his essay, The Looping Effects of Human Kinds. He says, there is an old and powerful idea that we acquire knowledge of humanity by replacing human kinds by physiological or mechanical or neuroelectrical or biomechanical ones. So, what kind of evidence is used as the basis for biologizing a kind? So for biologizing a schizophrenia, which we certainly tend to do, there's talk of the risk In general population, 1%. For relatives of an affected person, they are the non-twin sibling, 8%. The child of parent with schizophrenia, 12%. A fraternal twin, 12%. A child of two parents with schizophrenia, 40%. And identical twins, 47%. And we are often offered structural brain imaging evidence as well. Then we come to hacking's perhaps most interesting kinds, the interactive kinds. Of these, he says, people are affected by how they are categorized. In turn, people affect how they're categorized. Interactive kinds involve looping effects. We think of these kinds of people as given, as definite classes defined by definite properties, but actually they are moving targets because our investigations interact with the targets themselves and change them. That is the looping effect. Sometimes our sciences create kinds of people that, in a certain sense, did not exist before. That, says hacking, is making up people. Hacking thinks, possibly controversially, but I only report, that high-functioning autism is something that has been made up. It has become a way of being a person, a way of experiencing and of being in society. The interactions involved in making up this way of being embrace institutions, patterns of behaviour on the part of relevant professionals, and much else. Now, the phrase making up might seem to suggest a fiction, an invention, without a basis in reality. But hacking tries to avoid the crude dichotomies which might underlie such thinking. Once made up, categories acquire a kind of reality. Hacking also points to cases which are significantly made up, but special cases of which might have a biological basis. Obesity, for instance. Let's look at autism and Asperger's for a moment. Certainly the labels are shifting. You must judge whether this fact supports hacking here. Certainly in the case of autism, parents and children have interacted with these labels, and the criteria are shifting over time. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 4 identified a set of pervasive developmental disorders that are considered autism spectrum disorders, ASDs. These include autistic disorder, Asperger's disorder, and pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5 has some new things. The distinct diagnostic labels of autistic disorder, Asperger's disorder, and pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise classified are replaced by one umbrella term, autistic spectrum disorder. In DSM-5, further distinctions are made according to severity levels. The severity levels are based on the amount of support needed, due to challenges with social communication and restricted interests and repetitive behaviours. For example, a person might be diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder level 1, level 2, or level 3. The DSM-5 revision website said the reasons for using the umbrella term of autistic spectrum disorder were 1. The old way wasn't precise enough, and 2. Different clinicians diagnose the same person with different disorders, and some change their diagnosis of the same symptoms differently from year to year. And 2, autism is defined by a common set of behaviours, and it should be characterised by a single name according to severity. The removal of the former diagnoses of Asperger's disorder and pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise classified was a major change. People who held those diagnoses received a different diagnosis when re-evaluated. This certainly had the potential, and in fact it actually happened, to be confusing to parents of children with these diagnoses, as well as children and adults who identify strongly with their diagnoses. We're talking about looping effects and interaction. Let's have some examples. Here's one from Hacking's book, The Social Construction of What. He imagines, this is a thought experiment, a behaviour modification program to diminish symptoms and feelings of depression. Numerous kinds of behaviour are reinforced, all of which run counter to the classification depressed. By living in this new way, a certain chemical condition of the brain, thought to be correlated with depression, is alleviated. And here's a video clip that may show another example of how environmental features may cause brain changes rather than brain events being the cause of behaviours that include learning problems.
Up in cat.
The breakthrough came when they scanned the brains of children both before and after they were given help with their reading problems. After as little as 8 weeks of intensive one-to-one tuition, they found the brains of these children had changed, and changed dramatically. This is the scan of one child's brain before he'd received help with his reading. And this is his brain afterwards. This is another child before, and after, and another. These scans, which are believed to show normalization of brain function, have big implications. They mean that when it comes to reading, the neurological strengths and weaknesses children are born with are only the beginning of the story.
Effective instruction alters brain function. So these neural systems are plastic, they're malleable, they are sensitive to the effects of the environment.
So we may get neurological changes as a result of teaching. And we need to bear this in mind when we think of the kind of evidence adduced to biologize a humankind. Another example of the kind of looping effects and feedback, perhaps. ABA, or Applied Behavioural Analysis, is allegedly an effective treatment for autism. It's a behaviourism-informed program of reinforcement. In its early versions some years ago, it also employed deterrence. Now, if it does extinguish certain undesirable symptoms and or reinforce others, does it thereby actually alter brain functioning? Doesn't seem unlikely. Let's think about hacking on interactive kinds and how what he's talking about might apply to any learning disabilities. We have the internet. We have scientific, in quotes, accounts of particular disorders. We have support groups, charities, advice for parents, dietary advice. It's not that implausible that those classified in a particular way may undergo significant changes as a result of the relevant forces in contemporary society, including all these sources of information. There may well be looping effects of a kind that hacking is talking about. Classifying someone with a learning disability involves a way of being a person. Claiming that some learner classifications involve interactive kinds is controversial. So I'm going to try to give the idea that they involve in different kinds some serious consideration. There's an influential way of thinking about so-called natural kinds that involves essentialism. This way of thinking may originally be due to the philosopher John Locke, 1689, but it was made famous and very influential in the last century by the analytical philosophers Saul Kripke and Hilary Putnam. We often classify on the basis of typical observable properties. In 1750, someone might distinguish water from oil according to taste, colour, viscosity, and so forth. As science advances, people realise that underlying aspects of the object's inner structure explain these stereotypical observable properties. For example, salt is soluble, has a certain taste, crystalline form and colour. Its underlying chemical constitution as sodium chloride explains the surface features. Its underlying constitution is an essential property. To be salt, stuff must have this property. Salt is a natural kind. The reference of natural kind terms is not exhausted by the knowledge, understanding, and intentions of the individual user of the term. It involves external factors. Thus, people using the term water in 1750, as a matter of fact, succeeded in referring to H2O. This was so even though they had no idea at that time of the nature of water's chemical constitution. The speakers think that items such as water are members of the same natural kind if and only if they have some underlying, though perhaps currently unknown, common property. This is the so-called real essence of that kind. Chemical elements have some microstructural property. An object's real essence explains why that object or stuff has the nominal essence that it does. Now, nominal essence is basically the object's outward observable features. Empirical science discovers the real essences of objects. Now, I think there's no doubt that at least some contemporary thinking about learning disabilities belongs in this tradition. Those suffering from a specific learning disability are believed to share some kind of neural biological essence which explains their symptoms. And this way of thinking is also to be found in some conceptualizations of psychiatric disorders. So what about ADHD as a natural kind? Here's a quotation. I can't pretend to understand all those terms, but you get the drift. What about dyslexia as a natural kind? John Stein, 2017, says, "Thus it is clear that we have to look more deeply at the physiological mechanisms that cause phonological difficulties. These throw up clear differences between dyslexic and typically developing readers, particularly with respect to their auditory and visual temporal processing and sequencing." But can these essentialist intuitions, either about psychiatric disorders or about learning disabilities, be turned into coherent beliefs? Persisting states, whether linked to desirable traits such as intelligence or to deficits or dysfunctional states that may be associated with dyslexia, are sometimes associated with aspects of brain functioning. For instance, Nicholson talks of, quote, the intrinsic brain difference characteristic of dyslexia, of the neural circuits for declarative and procedural processing, and of explaining cognitive level deficits in terms of the brain structures that cause them. Some difficult, interesting, and important philosophical questions arise here. What does it mean to say that a specific human trait continues to exist over time. Dyslexia is just one rather special example. One source of persistence criteria for traits is the availability of directly observable features. Having blue eyes is a mundane example. The colour persists, though evidently it will seem to vary according to the lighting conditions at any one moment. It may gradually fade with age. Or again, having an illness over a period of time might be identified according to criteria linked to sustained observable symptoms. Evidently, however, cases of this kind may be much less straightforward than eye colour. Symptoms often change during the progress of the illness, one set being replaced by others in typical developmental sequences. How can we secure a robust meaning of a claim that the same condition has been present over time in these cases? We need to appeal to events within the body of the sufferer. For instance, characteristic internal physiological phenomena may be causally linked to a virus, and biologists will have to operate identity criteria for a virus over time. Identifying a human condition that persists over time is challenged by the comorbidity issue. For instance, there is extensive overlap between the symptoms of dyslexia and many other developmental disorders such as ADHD. Note in passing two distinct meanings of comorbidity. First, symptoms may be comorbid if they can be found to overlap when we look at particular individuals. But there's a second sense of comorbidity. If we research populations rather than particular individuals, we might say that two disorders are comorbid if they correlate positively. Consider then the challenge posed by comorbidity in the first of these senses. Overlapping symptoms are less than helpful when we're trying to pin down what it might mean for a specific condition to persist. Suppose that a permanent state, echoing in some ways the essential properties of natural kinds, could be discovered in individuals. A state apparently responsible for symptoms associated with, say, dyslexia. That discovery could form the basis of dyslexia's nature over time. It could not only trump the difficulties associated with the overlap between its symptoms and those of other disorders, it might actually be the focus of scientific research into how the symptoms could be mitigated. Now, a condition that does model this possibility is Down's syndrome. People with this condition have an extra copy of chromosome 21. Now, whether psychiatric disorders have essential properties has been widely debated by scholars from a variety of disciplines. Hacking 2013, in commenting on DSM-5, refers to the history of classifying mental illness. He noted a botanical emphasis. On the dubious grounds that organic illness classifications resemble plant classifications, it was thought that what was good enough for organic illnesses should be splendid for psychiatric disorders. Botanical classifications do not, in fact, precisely mirror natural kind categories, but they certainly have something of that flavour. The psychologist Haslam has researched the lay tendency to essentialist thinking about a range of phenomena, and these include traits, illnesses, and psychiatric illnesses. Adriaens and de Block, 2013, observe, quote, "Some patients desperately want to be labelled with a particular diagnosis and are willing to act according to the relevant diagnostic criteria. By conforming to their diagnosis, they contribute to the perception of homogeneity in the population of psychiatric patients." End of quote. But Nicholson and Eliot make points that count against natural kind thinking. They refer to the complexities involved in identifying the direction of causes here, whether that is to say symptoms associated with struggling readers result in any straightforward fashion from pre-existing biological neurophysiological conditions, or whether the biological conditions can wholly or in part amount to consequences of certain learning experiences. Nicholson observes that, quote, "there is a legitimate question over cause versus correlate." If causes can work in both directions, this challenges a purely essentialist account. The latter would run the causes from internal states of affairs to observable properties, just as in the case of the chemical elements. Zachar 2000 opposes essentialist understandings of mental disorders. He claims that psychiatry employs a pragmatic approach. Labels are applied just in case a sufficiently substantial number of DSM criteria are satisfied. Thomas Satz explored the possibility that some psychiatric disorders were associated with brain lesions of certain kinds. For him, illness had to have a biological foundation. Were the right kinds of brain lesions to be discovered, they could constitute the essence of a given disorder or illness, though Satz famously did not believe in such lesions and concluded, controversially, that mental illness is mythical. The possibility of a lesion, or the equivalent, seems to sit well with currently influential ways of seeing learning disorders. Along with many other commentators, Mahan 2014 says of learning disorders that, quote, "the dominant mode of representation is psychological cum medical. Students," he says, "are diagnosed as having a learning disability, an educational handicap, attention deficit disorder, ADD, or special needs. These representations place the problem inside the child's mind or brain." The philosopher Papineau, however, used an analogy with software. He argued that there might be no type of brain damage or persisting abnormality grounding psychiatric disorders. In terms of our current discussion, no persisting neurological essence. Instead, says Papineau, there could be brain events akin to malfunctioning software. If my computer's software is failing to function properly, it would be a mistake to think of peering inside in the hope of uncovering the equivalent of a silicon chip lesion or silicon chip dysfunction essence. The malfunction could well be instantiated in perfectly functioning circuits. In a recent research paper, the reality of dyslexia is explained in such a way that brain functioning is clearly implicated, yet Papineau's software analogy possibility, I think, is left open. Quote, "Dyslexia, the disorder seems to be the result of a subtle yet significant snarl in the brain's ability to process information about words." On the one hand, the expression snarl could refer to an organic lesion. It could, on the other hand, capture a problem with brain functioning that could be helpfully compared to a software issue, as Papineau suggests. I want to spend a few moments on the term malfunctioning. Within the so-called theoretical domain, how should malfunctioning be understood? When we speak of malfunctioning organs such as the heart, we refer to that which does or does not contribute to the survival of the organism. A short-term version would relate quite literally to whether the malfunction was life-threatening, while a broader interpretation would encompass biological fitness and whether the malfunction restricted the organism's capacity to reproduce. Now, these biological interpretations are not obviously applicable to a snarl, the term attached by our researcher Underwood to dyslexia. For something to have a biological function is for it to have an evolutionary history. This explains its current existence by reference to those of its past effects, and these have contributed to its reproductive fitness and subsequent survival and replication. Do learning disabilities do they affect chances of human reproduction? Probably not, but that possibility is more plausible for some psychiatric disorders, sadly. Accordingly, I would argue that comprehensively to characterize the snarl here, we have to appeal to social phenomena outside the head of the person with the malfunctioning brain. One approach to naturalizing the notion of malfunction is to reference it to what is normal in the social environment of our sufferer. And what is normal is to be operationalized in statistical terms. What is normal varies from one place to another and also will change over time. We are already moving further and further away from a purely biological account of disorder. Bingham and Banner 2014 note that on a statistical basis and considering normal functioning in this light, homosexuality would count as dysfunctional in many societies. Some would regard this point alone as constituting a reductio ad absurdum of any statistical construal of dysfunction or even snarl. If we look for alternative notions of function, we are back with the normative, the purposes that brains should fulfill. Kingma 2014 contrasts two approaches to health and disease. The approach dubbed naturalism views the terms health and disease as free of value, and the relevant classifications as, quote, representing the world as it is, rather than our evaluation of how things are, end of quote. Normativists deny such a value-free status and insist that decisions about treatments and resources are driven by normative concerns. Kingma argues that the naturalism normativist distinction is only really important in the theoretical domain, and this domain concerns the biological, whereas the realm of moral and social decision-making relates to the applied domain. She holds that it's obvious that in the applied domain, a, quote, completely value-free account of health and disease cannot directly determine moral and social decision-making, end of quote. We bring in the values of particular cultures, what counts as important learning, and much else. Hacking emphasizes the importance of norms in how we classify people. ADHD and dyslexia taxonomies reflect assumptions about what is normal behavior and language processing behavior in a wide range of contexts. The use of the ADHD label relates to what behavior is valued in classrooms and what behavior is deemed inconvenient, hence dysfunctional. In a different culture, so-called difficulties in concentrating might be taken as a sign of intelligence in the face of a ghastly school environment. So classifications in terms of dysfunction are not independent of culture and value. I'm thinking of a poignant case, a couple with 2 adult sons who are severely autistic. One of them, Paul, who's now in his 30s, is cosmically extrovert and is exhausting to live with. Yet his mother says she has learned much from her sons about how to be human, about the point of life. This is not to deny, of course, the existence of what we find to be distressing symptoms sometimes, nor is it to assert that no learner classifications whatever can be biologized, and Down syndrome would be a case in point. At this point in the session, we're looking at outside the head to see how that informs how we categorize learners. I want to take this further. To do so, 2 key philosophical ideas are needed. Consider first the concept of the constitutive rule. In an early article, the well-known political philosopher John Rawls distinguished between 2 kinds of rules, the regulative and the constitutive. Regulative rules include everyday rules we encounter, such as drive on the left, keep off the grass, and so forth. Examples of constitutive rules are the rules of games such as chess. The rules governing how a castle-shaped piece may be moved horizontally or vertically mean that certain actions, physical actions with the piece, become moving the rook acts. The rules constitute the actions concerned. The actions are what they are in virtue of the rules. The second notion of what's going on outside the head of learners is that of collective intentionality. The American philosopher John Searle has had much to say about this. There are everyday individual intentions. I intend to shave this morning and to walk to work later. In addition, group intentions feature at the heart of our social reality. For example, group intentions ground the meanings of road signs and the value of a £20 note. Group intentions underlie the very existence of constitutive rules such as those of chess. We intend that chess rules should apply worldwide. As long as we intend this, we sustain in existence those rules according to which moving that castle-shaped piece in a certain way on the 8x8 squared board just is a rook move. We intend that such and such a road sign means that you must not drive faster than 50 miles an hour, and that the £20 note has such and such a place in our economic and monetary system. Both constitutive rules and collective intentionalities are central to the functioning of language in its broadest sense. When an English speaker uses the word dog, she succeeds in saying what she intends partly in virtue of the existence of collective intentions sustaining constitutive rules about the function of that word. If she uttered a very similar sound in a country where a language other than English is spoken, she may be credited with a different meaning. It follows, I want to suggest, that the notion of a snarl cannot be separated conceptually and constitutively from these social phenomena in which individuals are embedded. A snarl can only be fully characterized with reference to language. The term's definition links it explicitly with the capacity to deal with words. This in turn means that the very conception of a snarl incorporates aspects of social reality. An assertion that a snarl exists is about both something inside a person in their brain and about their social and cultural environment. The said aspects of social reality are not fixed, of course. They will vary over time and from one social context to another. So all these points seem to me to distance conceptions of disorders such as dyslexia from anything exclusively inside individuals that would parallel the inner constitutions of natural kinds. In my 2008 paper, I questioned the robustness of an essentialist perspective on some of the labels currently awarded to learners, drawing on Ian Hacking's studies of kinds. Hacking explores the implications of making strong assertions about the reality of psychiatric disorders and of some learning disorders. For instance, he would like to say that there were no multiple personalities in 1955, yet by 1985 many were diagnosed with it. He appreciates that expressing claims in this fashion is contentious. Such ontological assertions excite controversy partly because they seem permeated with scepticism about the relevant phenomena. It is as if the conditions concerned are merely constructed by people as opposed to really existing in the light of some kind of biological substrate. Moreover, if conditions are constructed, could they be dispensed with? Returning to our essentializing dispositions, a subtle and important variant of making up people may include processes that encourage non-specialists to believe in essentialism for psychiatric conditions. Adrians and de Block explore this possibility, referring to a folk biology involving an essentializing mentality that can extend its grip to ethnic groups and types of personality. I want to ask whether such folk thinking gets applied to learning disorders, including dyslexia and ADHD. Now, even if it does, it's important to note that they do not actually settle the issue of whether, for instance, dyslexics really do share some kind of common essence. Suppose conceptualizing dyslexia as a condition with essential properties is motivated by that folk essentializing mentality. It still might be true that the majority of those awarded a dyslexia label actually do share one or more objectively identifiable features. To think otherwise would be to commit the classic origin fallacy. To have suspicions about the irrational origins of a label does not, by itself, rule out the possibility that the label's status could be supported on better grounds. If psychiatric and learning disorders could appropriately be conceptualized along the lines of natural kinds with essential properties, then we should be able to distinguish sharply between those with the disorders and those without. After all, either a substance is gold or it is not, depending on its inner atomic constitution. However, it is sometimes claimed in this connection that we need to be clear about the difference between so-called dimensional disorders and taxonic disorders. Dimensional disorders are characterized by the absence of clear boundaries between disorder and non-disorder. In the case of taxonic disorders, there are clear boundaries. Haslam, Holland and Cuppens, 2012, argue that the majority of frequently encountered disorders are dimensional. Examples of the latter include headaches, and according to DSM-5 at least, autism, with its extended category of autism spectrum disorder, ASD, is dimensional. A useful clear-cut case to note in this connection is Down syndrome, which is taxonic as far as its biological basis is concerned. Yet symptoms of this disorder vary in their severity between one individual and another. Dyslexia symptoms present themselves with different levels of severity. Nevertheless, it does not immediately follow from this that dyslexia itself is a dimensional disorder. Compare it with measles. Either an individual has measles or she does not. Presumably, measles is a taxonic disorder. Yet, measles symptoms come in many strengths and sizes. This is so complicated, isn't it? Some of Nicholson's commentary suggests that he construes dyslexia as a taxonic disorder, especially his extensive discussion of neurological factors. However, he is never explicit about this, and he can argue that if his preferred option is to see dyslexia as dimensional, this fails to undermine the potential importance of neurological factors. It only counts against seeing the condition as having a natural kind type of status, because natural kinds are not dimensional, they are taxonic. Eliot claims that it's now widely accepted that reading ability and disability is dimensional. Therefore, there can be no clear-cut dyslexic, non-dyslexic distinction. Consider a classic question relating to these issues. Just how should the potential candidates for the dyslexia label be selected in the first instance? You could start with what you believed was a relevant neurological feature. You might select subjects on that basis from the wider set of students with language difficulties. How would you know what to look for in the brain? But let's leave that one on one side. Just suppose that you could initiate such a project. If you succeeded, you might in effect be constructing a taxonic feature for the dyslexia label. You could instead choose to classify as dyslexics those individuals whose difficulties are debilitating beyond a certain cut-off point. I think that's Joe's view. If you did that, you might be building a dimensional character into the label. So you would be less than surprised at being unable to pinpoint a specific neural feature common to all those labelled in this way. Another option for labelling is to highlight a key feature of observable difficulties, such as poor phonological awareness. I understand phonological awareness in the standard way as the capacity to grasp that words are made up from a variety of sounds. Again, this looks as though it would build in a dimensional character for the label. Nevertheless, Nicholson observes that, quote, dyslexia is associated with delayed neural commitment, which will lead to delays not only in phonological processing, but also in various others of the readiness capabilities. Does this, after all, hint at a taxonic interpretation? Very, very complicated, all this. Informed uncertainty. Even if dyslexia is dimensional rather than taxonic, this in turn fails to settle whether it is real. If it is not taxonic, it can still be real in some sense, but it cannot then be appropriate to think of dyslexia in natural kind terms. The philosopher Rachel Cooper asks important questions about what it means to say a disorder is real. At one point, she echoes J.L. Austin in his Sense and Sensibilia, quote, "We should start by specifying what possible alternatives we have in mind," end of quote. That is to say, what alternatives would the reality of the disorder rule out? For instance, in asking whether a disorder is real, we might be wondering whether it is tied to specific cultures or whether it is universal. Yet, observes Cooper, quote, "disorders that are found only in certain places and times need not be fakes," end of quote. Even if dyslexia is not universal, but only found within certain cultures or within certain communities speaking particular languages, it would not follow from this alone that it was not real in some sense. Cooper comments that only involuntary conditions are disorders. Voluntary but undesirable behaviours are non-disorder forms of deviance. The reality of the disorder would now be linked to the idea that it's something that happens to the individuals concerned rather than something about which they can make choices. Now, whether a condition happens to an individual rather than being under their control is arguably a necessary but not a sufficient condition for it being real. For not all psychological processes falling into this passive category are disorders of any kind. The ancient word for emotion is passion. This term identifies certain psychological phenomena that happen to an individual. It distinguishes them from other psychological events and processes that are, at least to some degree, under that person's voluntary control. Arguably, few emotional states or passions are real disorders in any sense, though inevitably there are some tricky cases to consider here. Suppose someone is overtaken by a very powerful emotion. We sometimes metaphorically observe that they are beside themselves. They are in a state at least akin to a disorder, albeit hopefully a temporary one. What are the educational implications of the status of existence claims about disorders? Suppose we could make biological sense of the possibility of distinct bases for each learning disability. Then, unique treatments or learning programs or whatever might be needed for each one. If, for instance, dyslexia is linked to a very specific neurological phenomenon, we might devise specific treatment for it. Compare this with the medical treatment for measles and chickenpox. Imagine we want to prevent these diseases or to tackle them directly rather than merely dealing with their symptoms. Indeed, this is exactly what we do want. We need to know about their underlying causes, viz. the characteristics of each virus and how they attack the human body. Of course, it might turn out that distinct neurological conditions might be addressed effectively by one and the same treatment. But this is unlikely. We would probably need distinctive treatments for each condition, each so-called learning disorder. Perhaps, though, as some have argued, it makes no sense to think of specific biological essences to go with each learning disability category. Perhaps it's better to think in a broad fashion about brain abnormality. If we're dealing with observable pupil achievements, then the comorbidity phenomenon should be uppermost in our minds. It makes sense to look for a treatment that tackles poor achievement. We bracket off consideration of underlying causes. An analogy is where we treat the fever resulting from measles, flu and mumps. The fever might be reduced with aspirin or paracetamol, regardless of its cause. So some concluding remarks. There is no short, simple and coherent route from neuroscience alone to assertions that conditions such as dyslexia really exist. I am not saying that genetics and biology are not involved in some way. Of course they are. I'm arguing that we can't get a straightforward answer to the question, does such and such a disability really exist? To repeat, my aim throughout this talk has been to develop your informed uncertainty, a grasp of at least some of the complexities here. Don't shoot the messenger. Suppose it is true that at least some learner categories cannot aspire to the status of indifferent kinds. If so, the learners concerned should be regarded as belonging on a continuum with their fellows, so they should be treated accordingly. They are on a par with their fellow pupils, though their achievements may be particularly worrying. The status of the categories we apply to our learners has significant implications for how they should be treated. Awareness of all this is very important if they are to be treated fairly. Thank you.